So friends, we are recording, which means if you do not want potentially your tiny little box to be recorded, please turn off your camera. I am also going to mute all so that we don't randomly get dog barking, because that happens sometimes. There we go. All right, we're off to the races. So, for those of you that have not joined us before, welcome to Stories with Spirit. Welcome to virtual storytelling over the internet. It's been sort of a wild ride. Anne and I did our first show in May, and I think this is number 17 after that from us. So it's been great. For those of you that have been supporting us, thank you so much. For those of you that are new, thank you so much for being here. It is so great to see new faces. If you are not used to the world of Zoom, if you are on a computer or a tablet, I believe, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there should be a little button that says View. If you click on that button, you can switch between Gallery View, which is the sort of Brady Bunch, Hollywood Squares, Muppet Show look, depending on your cultural reference, or Speaker View, which is the person making the most noise, in this case, probably me. You are welcome to pick whichever one you want. Please view as you like. Some people like actually watching the audience in one of these shows. And again, I ask if you feel comfortable, let us see your faces. Turn on your cameras. Again, we don't care if you're eating dinner. We don't care if you're sitting in your living room. Let us see your faces. Because of the new Zoom settings, I can't tell anybody to unmute themselves. So at the end of each storyteller, there's a little selection that says ask all to unmute, and you will see a little pop-up on your screen that says the host is asking you to unmute. Would you like to? So if you would like to clap at the end of a story, you're welcome to unmute yourself. You'll hear clapping, the screen will bounce around to a bunch of different people, and then again, I will mute everyone, and while we are telling stories, I will disallow people from unmuting themselves, because I've had those problems where someone walks, in the middle of a piece, someone ends up unmuting themselves, and, we hear them yelling at their dogs or whatever else it is. So that just gives us a little protection. Some of you are familiar with the concept of Zoom bombing, wherein people come in to purposely disrupt something. This has happened to us once. It was bad, but not terrible. It got solved relatively quickly. But if something does happen, much like in a live show, if some drunk stood up in the middle of the show and started yelling, we would pause for a moment. We wouldn't try to work through that. We would figure it out and we would make them leave, and then we would get back to the show. So if something does happen, we do reserve the right to pause and then to continue. For those of you that helped share the show around, thank you so much. Word of mouth is the absolutely best marketing that we have, and so thank you so much for sharing it around, for telling your friends. If some of you have asked this question, I've gotten a couple emails about it already. This is a pay what it's worth show. And what that means is at the end of the show, I will ask you what you thought an hour and a half of art was worth to you. And if it was worth something to you, everybody will receive an email at about 7:45 Colorado time. So adjust for your own time zone. So in about an hour and 40 minutes. That will have links to PayPal, to Venmo, to Zelle, because someone paid in Zelle, and so I've added it to the link list. If check is more comfortable, you can send a check. If you do send a check, please make it out to Cooper-Braun-Enos or Cooper-Braun LLC. Stories with Spirit is not a legal entity. Please, all of the money goes to me, and then we divide it 3 ways instead of asking everybody to try to pay 3 times, because that would be silly. So I do ask you, what is this art worth to you? And if it's worth something to you, we would love you to show that. And if right now life is really hard, then your presence here is worth that to us. Please be our audience and think nothing more. So all that said, we're going to be off to the races. This show tonight, February is often shows about love. And while love stories are great, as we were sort of figuring out what we wanted to tell, we kept coming back to stories about light and fire, and that balance between light and darkness and fire and cold. And so that's what tonight's going to be about. The show is called Fire in the Dark, and we have picked a bunch of different stories to figure out what those will be. And so thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to start us off tonight, and then Anna's going to go, and then Pam, and then we're going to go through the series once again, and then we will be done. So this first story comes out of a tradition in Europe that I love, wherein biblical characters suddenly just become folk characters. That there's a whole time in Europe where there are folk tales where Jesus and Peter were walking one day and the stories that happened to them. This is not a Jesus and Peter story, but it is, shall we say, the church would frown on it being as particular. And thank you, Steph, for spotlighting me. Sorry, I didn't do that myself. I just moved myself to speaker mode. All right. Once, long ago, when the world was young, man held dominion over the earth, but he did not hold dominion over fire. Men and women, they had heard of fire. They had seen fires sweep across the grasslands. They had seen timber burn. They had seen lightning strike. But there were no fires in homes, no people crowded around fire in the warm or in the cold. And in the summer months, this was bearable. You could get through the summer months. But in the winter, people huddled together in their homes, shivering, trying to make it through the cold. And there was one year. There was in a certain village, the fall had come on and the smell of snow was in the air. The threat of snow, the threat of cold, dark, hard times. And the elders of the village gathered together. And they spoke up and down and back and forth. And they kept coming back to hell. For they knew that the devils had fire down in hell. And there they used it for dark ends, but they knew also that it was warm. And it pushed back the dark, but no one wanted to go to hell. Everyone had some secret sin upon himself or herself, and no one thought, even if they made it in, that they would ever make it out. And then someone spoke the question. What about Anthony? What about Anthony? What about Anthony? What about Anthony? So quickly did this question spread that no one even knew who asked it first. Was it a little boy? Was it an old woman? When later he died, he would be called Saint Anthony the Great. But in those days, he was just Anthony. He was a hermit that lived at the edge of that town in a wasted place. He was a swineherd. He kept a great flock of pigs, which often he gave to those in need or traded for the little things he needed to keep himself between heaven and earth. What about Anthony? If anyone could do it, it might be him. And so together the whole town trooped out, and they saw the little stone hut he called his home. And they saw him seated there upon a rock before it, with his staff over his shoulder, overlooking his flock of pigs. He smiled to see the town coming. My friends, I have not enough in my poor house to welcome you all as guests, but you are welcome nonetheless. And then they asked him. They told him, we need someone to go to hell, to bring back fire. And he thought on it, and then he smiled. Very well. Then I will do it. I will set forth this very day. And as he stood and picked up his staff, he looked over his pigs, and there was that one pig. And if this pig had been a human, he would have been a 17-year-old boy with broad shoulders, very proud of himself. He had the kind of smile that a pig might smile if he had been just told his parents were leaving for the weekend. He'd been given the keys to the car, and he knew where his father kept the liquor. And St. Anthony smiled back at his pig. You are coming with me. And he tapped his pig on the nose with his staff, and the pig was compelled to fall in beside him. And together, they made their way away from that wasteland out into the world. All day they walked as the sun moved overhead and the threat of snow was on the air. But hell is always closer than you think. And it was not before the sun had set they saw it. They saw that great rift in the earth and the path leading down. And together they began to traverse that path down the side of that rift as the sun set and it grew dark, but the dark was not complete. For from the earth there came a flicker of flame, and the deeper they went, the warmer it grew. So warm, a warm they were not accustomed to at this time of year. Down and down and down they went, and then they came around that corner and they saw them. The great iron gates of hell. And from beyond them they heard cries, wails, lamentation, and the flicker of flames. Anthony was not impressed. He walked up to the gates, he rapped on them with his staff, and they were opened by a small imp with gray skin and curling horns and a fine blue waistcoat. "You don't belong here." And he slammed the gates in St. Anthony's face. This was not the reception Anthony expected, and again he rapped on the gates, and again they were opened. "Okay, let me explain. You have no sins upon your soul. If you're dead, go up, not down. You don't belong here. We have nothing to offer you. We're not buying. Bye." And he slammed the gates again. Anthony gave his pig a prod with his staff, and the pig began to root and snuffle and grumble there at the gates of hell. They saw the gate crack open, look up and down. They closed. They heard whispers behind and sounds like roast pork, bacon, bandied back and forth, and finally the gates were opened once more. "All right, it's been decided. The pig can come in, but you have to stay out." St. Anthony stepped back, and the pig, he stepped his way into hell. And no sooner had all four of the pig's trotters entered hell than, well, he began to raise hell, literally. Screams and crashes and cries emanated forth from behind those gates. Soot and devils and flames and cinders were being thrown every which way. And finally, the little devil opened up the gates again. His horns were all bent backwards. His waistcoat was covered with pig tracks. "Okay, you can come in, but you have to make the pig leave. Deal?" St. Anthony acquiesced. He entered hell, and there was all flame and smoke and darkness and screams, and there in one corner he saw his pig had backed a dozen devils up into the corner and looked as if he was deciding which one he would eat first. But they never got to decide which devil would be eaten first. Anthony, he tapped his pig with his staff, and the pig stepped back. But Anthony found that hell was, if nothing else, warm. And his bones were cold from the long walk that day, and he sat himself down before one of those hell fires, and he warmed his hands, put up his feet on top of his pig, and he sat there. And as he did, the devils went back to their work, for there was nothing for it. But as they walked back and forth, Anthony saw that their work was slovenly. They were slow about it, and he began to prod them as they worked. "Get on with it, get on with it. You can go faster than that, my little man. Get on with it." And finally, after an hour of this, one great huge devil with red skin, curling horns, a top hat, and a frock coat made his way over to Anthony. "Sir, I get that we cannot touch you. We cannot harm you nor force you to leave except by your own volition. But can I ask you to stop abusing the help? They're working as hard as they can. Please leave them to their jobs." Anthony relaxed. He set his staff there on the ground, but in that moment, just in that moment, there came sprinting through the gates of hell one little imp. It was his very first day on the job. He had a brand new red scarlet waistcoat made for him by his grandmother, and he was so excited. "Lucifer, Lucifer, I got one! I got my very first soul, Lucifer, I got one!" And then he tripped on the staff St. Anthony had laid on the floor, and he went headfirst straight into that pile of cinders. And he came up wiping this soot out of his eyes and spitting it out of his mouth, and his waistcoat was ruined. And in that moment, he did not recognize who or what Anthony was. And he walked up to him. "Don't you know there are rules, and you can't leave things laying around on the floor, otherwise people trip over them. There are rules for a reason." He took up St. Anthony's staff, and he shoved it there into that hellfire, and no sooner had it touched the flames, but then St. Anthony's pig got up, and he eyed that little devil with eyes that began to sparkle red, and he pawed at the ground, and the little devil gave one yelp and took off with the pig after him, and hell was raised literally once more. Pigs and cinders and soot and souls and devils flying every which way, until the big overseer devil made his way back. "Sir, I really need to ask you to leave. Could you do that for me?" St. Anthony acquiesced. He took up his staff, he prodded his pig. The pig spat out the wee devil, and out the gates of hell they went. Those great iron gates that clanged closed behind them with cries of, "And stay out!" And they began to make their way up and up and up into the darkness. But as they did, they found it was not so dark. For what that little devil had not known is that the center of St. Anthony's staff was hollow. And when he had shoved it into the hellfire, a coal had caught therein, and it had begun to smolder, and then to burn, and then to smoke. And as Anthony stepped into the upper world, what he held in his hand was a torch that blazed with light. Once, twice, 3 times he spun it over his head, and the sparks, they flew up and up and up and up like 1,000 new stars, and then they fell down. And where they touched the ground, they began to kindle. And the people saw them, and they ran to them, and they scooped up those sparks and those coals in bowls and crockery, and they brought them into their own homes. And they fed them with sticks and straw until they burned. And for the first time, people sat around fires. They saw one another's faces in the darkness, and they sat in warmth as the snow began to fall. And in the days that followed, they built hearths for themselves. They learned to burn hard wood. And as that winter came in, for the first time, night was not so dark nor so cold. For the fire, it pushed it back. And the warmth and the light, the people gathered. And they sang songs and they told stories in joy late into the night, as we will do here.
All right.
Thank you.
That was excellent.
Hey, excellent. Thank you.
Magnificent. Loved it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo.
Hey.
Thank you, everybody.
That was great.
Anne, would you unmute yourself? I'm having trouble spotlighting myself. So, welcome, please, Rachel Ann Harding, my good friend.
I already did it.
All right, and I'm gonna mute all, and then you're off to the races.
All right. I don't know about you guys, but I have like a new crush, and it's like a pig with the look of a 17-year-old boy. That was the cutest pig I've ever. Oh my gosh. I want to meet that pig. Anyway. Marukla lived with her stepsister Helen and her stepmother. Now, if this were an Italian fairy tale, the 2 girls would get along, but this is a Russian fairy tale, so no such luck. Now, Marukla, she was not necessarily prettier than her stepsister Helen, but she was more well-liked. She always had a joke to tell, or a tune to whistle. She knew that people liked a beer in the evening and a little something in their tea over conversation. And there were more boys that were interested in Marukla than Helen. Now, their stepmother, Marukla's stepmother, noticed this and did her best to take that twinkle out of Marukla's eye. And in the fashion of many stepmothers of many stories, she put her to work. Marukla was put to work on the farm, caring for the animals and looking after everything in the house. Helen, she did nothing. She did not raise a hand and often bossed Marukla around as her stepmother did. Marukla did everything she was asked. She knew the consequences if she did not, often blows or spiteful words. But Marukla had her own ways of getting back, leaving the clothes a little musty, serving the porridge with a little bit of spit. And in that way, she was able to have her own small rebellions. Now, it was winter, the turning of the year, and they sat round the fire. Marukla always trying to find how to be close to the flames, but far away from her stepmother and stepsister. And Helen sat there, lounging in front of the fire, twirling her hair, and my clothes smell musty, Marukla. You purposely leave them long enough to smell this way. Go gather me some wood violets so I smell fresh. Marukla looked at Helen. It is winter, have you not noticed? But before she could finish that sentence, her stepmother had thrust her out of the house. She had only time to grab her coat before the door was closed behind Marukla, and she stood there in the snow and the wind. It was so cold it brought tears to her eyes, and the wind froze those tears on the edges of her eyelashes. She wrapped her coat round her, and she thought, maybe if I make my way through the snow, I can find a neighbor's house to go to, and they will let me stay by their fire for the night, and I will figure out what to do in the morning. She set off. She decided to make it through the woods instead of taking the road. There was just as much snow on either, and maybe she would cut some of her time. And as she made her way through the drifts of snow in the woods, she looked under the boughs of those trees. There were warm, dark spaces, or at least spaces with less snow. And she thought maybe she would curl up under one of those and sleep forever. But as she made her way through that snow, she saw a flicker of light ahead of her in the darkness. And while it looked like a candle, she made her way towards it. And as she got closer, she realized it was not a candle, but a flame. It was not a flame, but a bonfire. And as she got close enough to see it, it was a huge bonfire up on the mountain. And around that bonfire sat 12 men. Now, each of these men were bent towards the fire, but 3 of them had long gray beards like icicles. They were dressed in blue. 3 of them were young, like the young men in her village, and they were dressed in a light green and sat as if they still had youth in their bones. 3 of them sat as if they were ready to go tend the fields. They had just the beard on their face, and they were ready for work. And then the last 3, they had the first silver frost in their beards, dressed in reds, and they wore a little bit of the world on their shoulders. Marukla realized the stories that her father had told her were true. These were the months of the year that sat around the fire and traded the year between them. She made her way towards that fire, and as she stepped into that circle of light, she felt the warmth from the fire. She felt their eyes on her. She nodded politely and held out her hands. The oldest one looked at her, his beard long, his coat blue. "Child, what are you doing here?" "Forgive me for coming to your fire uninvited, sir. Father January, I suppose. You see, I have been sent into the wilderness to look for wood violets." January looked at her. "Child, it is winter. There are no wood violets that grow at this time." I am aware of that, but my stepsister Helen is not very observant, and I have to find the wood violets or else I will sleep in the snow forever." January considered this and realized that was the truth. And he looked at one of those young men dressed in green. "Brother March, help this child." And March stood up and looked at her in a way that made her feel warm in a way the fire had not. And he said, "She is not so much a child, brother." He waved his hand over the fire, and within that circle of light, the snow melted, the green grass grew, and then the buds burst forth, wood violets, a beautiful carpet around her. March himself helped pick the flowers and let them fall from his hands into her apron, always looking at her face. When her apron was full, March sat down, January waved his hand, and the snow came back in. It was once again cold and blowing. "Thank you," Marukla said as she looked at the men, and then she turned and made her way back down the mountain, all the way to her door. She pounded on it until they opened it and watched as Helen and her stepmother gaped in surprise. She poured the violets out across the table. "Where did you find those?" "I found them under a hedge that had not frozen." Marukla decided to lie. The next day, Marukla could feel Helen's eyes on her. Helen watched Marukla as she moved around about her tasks. And when Marukla sat down finally in front of the fireplace, Helen immediately said, "Marukla, it's been so long since I've had strawberries. I would like some strawberries. It will help my complexion, I think. Marukla said, you think that'll help your complexion? But before she could say anything else, she was once again out the door on the doorstep with that warning, don't come back unless you have those berries. She stepped out into the snow. Maybe she would go to the church tonight, beg for sanctuary. It may not be warm, but it would at least be out of the cold. She made her way once again through the woods, and there was that flicker of light that grew into a flame, that grew into a bonfire up on the mountain. She made her way up there. There were the 12 men. She nodded to them. She stepped close to the fire. She held out her hands. Brother January, Marukla, you've returned. Yes, I am looking for strawberries today. It seems that Helen thinks they would better her complexion. I do not think they will. January looked about. It is winter, Marukla. Yes, Helen has not noticed that yet. And if I do not get them, I will sleep in the snow. January nodded, looked across the fire. Brother June, help this child. June stood, waved his hand across the fire. The flames leapt, the snow melted, the green grass grew, and there were the strawberry plants pushing out. There were the white flowers that quickly turned into hard green berries and then ripened into red, juicy berries. Marukla looked around her. They were covering the space around her feet. June said, gather them quickly, and did not help her gather them. But she did. Into her apron, she put as many berries as she could hold. She could feel the warmth from those berries on her legs. And when January waved his hand over the fire, that warmth stayed in her apron. As she thanked the men, she turned and she went back into the snow. She only had to knock once on her door. It was opened, and there were the surprised looks as she poured those berries out onto the table. Where did you find them? Asked Helen. Oh, under some hay that had been spread across the fields. It seems that they were preserved under the snow. Helen ate all of them. She did not share with Marukla, as was to be expected, but she also did not share with her mother. The next day, Marukla knew. She avoided the fireplace as long as she could. She washed, she cleaned, she did everything she could to avoid that moment to sit down, but she eventually had to sit in front of the warmth, and the moment she did, Marukla, I miss dessert. I would like charlotka. It's made with apples, you know, and none of the ones we have are fresh. Go get me some apples. Helen looked at Marukla, and Marukla held her gaze and decided not to remind her it was winter anymore. She simply stood, she got her coat, and Marukla walked into the snow. She had thought maybe she would go to town if she didn't see the flame. But you know she did. She saw that flame. She made her way towards it, and there were the men sitting around the fire. Again, she nodded to them. She stood and warmed her hands, and January said, Marukla, you're making a habit of this. Yes, I am, and I'm very sorry. I must find apples, or else I shall sleep in the snow and freeze. And January considered this. Winter has no need for you, child. Brother September, help her. September stood. He waved his hand. The grass beneath her feet grew and then turned a soft yellow, as if in late summer. In that grass up grew a little sapling and into a tall apple tree. The apple tree burst forth with blossoms, and then soon those hard apples appeared, ripening into beautiful yellow spheres. But they were so high in the tree, Marukla could not reach them. So when they were ripe, she went to the tree and she put her hands around the trunk and she shook it once, and poof, an apple fell. She shook it twice, and poof, another apple fell. That is enough, said September. She picked up those 2 apples. She thanked the men. And then she turned and she walked through the snow. Now, when she made it home, The door was not locked. She walked right in. Helen and her stepmother stood waiting, ready for her to empty her apron, and their faces were a bit disappointed when she just simply set those 2 golden apples on the table. "Well, where are the rest?" asked Helen. She was very disappointed. 2 apples? How did you not get more? "Well," said Marukla, as honestly as she could, "the shepherd of the tree would only allow me to take 2. The shepherd of the tree. If I were there, I would take as many apples as I wished. And so I will go and get as many as I want myself." Marukla did not argue with Helen, though her stepmother tried to stop her. Helen put on her coat. She stepped out the door. The snow had stopped falling. And so Helen could easily follow Marukla's steps in the snow, through those dark woods, up the mountain to that flickering flame. And there was the bonfire. There were the 12 men. She hesitated for just a moment. And then she tossed her head and she walked into that circle and she began to warm her hands over the fire. The oldest one with the long white beard, wearing blue, looked at her. "Child, do you need something?" "I do not need anything from you, Graybeard." "Ah," said Brother January, "that is good to know." He waved his hand and the winter came in. Helen turned to run, to find those footsteps in the snow, but in a storm like that, one might only make it a dozen steps before those footprints disappeared. One might only make it a little bit further before the snow began to cover them like a mother tucking in her child. At the little house, Marukla and her stepmother stood at the window looking out into the snow that was now falling thick and fast and furious. Marukla's stepmother was worrying, what if those shepherds have tempted her to stay? What if she has not found the tree? What if she is lost in the snow? I must go find her. And Marukla, she did not argue. And so out into the snow, her stepmother went, and the snow continued to fall. And Marukla, she filled her belly for the first time in many months. She warmed her hands at that house fire and was warm all over. And she prayed, maybe not as hard as she should have, but she prayed that they would be safe in that snow and eventually come home. And she continued to offer prayers as the weeks turned into months and they never did return. Marukla, she cared for the house, she cared for the land, she cared for the animals. And when she was old enough, she married a young man from the village. And she teased him that he reminded her of a man who had helped her gather wood violets once in the middle of winter.
That was fantastic.
Beautifully done. That was great.
Lovely, lovely.
Yay.
Thank you.
That was a great story.
Wow.
Thank you.
That was a great story.
Well told.
Wait, we're supposed to unmute, I think.
We can't hear. There we go. I guess when you mute all, you mute all. So I'm so pleased to introduce our next teller. She is the reason this is happening this evening, the reason for the season, bringing us together, saying she would like to do a show. And Pam is a storyteller that Cooper and I met pretty early on in our storytelling adventures and were enchanted by her use of language and use of silence and movement. And we're so glad to have her here today. You have a number of recordings, I believe, Pam, and you do many workshops as well as biblical storytelling. And so she's someone to follow online on her website, but tonight she is someone to listen to. We're going to listen to a story from Pam Farrow.
Thanks so much, Anne. I'm delighted to be here tonight with Anne and Cooper and everyone else here.
So we're going to go now to the land of Japan. In one of its northern regions, long ago, there lived a young woodcutter. His name was Minokichi. He lived at home with his mother, and he had learned his trade from old Mosaku from the village. Sometimes Minokichi would go out by himself, but he liked it better when he could pair up with old Musaku, and they would go to the river, and sometimes they would go the long way and take the bridge over into the forest on the other side. But it was shorter to take the ferry over. And once they got to the other side of the river, they would find dead trees that they would chop down and cut into just the right lengths, bundle them together, and carry them back home, whether across the bridge or the ferry, back to the village, and sell. And this was how Minokichi supported himself and his mother. One winter's day, Minokichi and old Mosaku had gone, and they had taken the ferry across the river, and they'd gone into the woods and found some wonderful dead trees to cut down and put into just the right bundles that they knew would sell well back in the village. But they'd stayed a little bit longer than they'd intended and had traveled a little bit farther than they'd intended. And the snow was beginning to fall as the darkness was coming on, and they put their bundles of firewood on their back and started walking as swiftly as they could, but the snow came down more swiftly still, and it feathered into their faces and covered the pathways, and they tried to find their way back to the river, but by that time the snow was swirling so thickly they could barely see beyond their noses. Well, finally they came to the edge of the river, and to their horror, the ferry was not there. It was on the other side. And they called and called, but even if their voice could have been heard on the other side, there was no ferryman there, for he had gone home in the storm. Well, it was much too far, even if they could have seen well enough to get to the bridge further down the river. They looked around, and luckily, there was a small ferryman's hut right there. Well, it wasn't much shelter at all. It was so old, and there were gaps between the wooden boards, so that when they went inside, the wind and the snow came through those gaps, and they closed the door as best they could and put wood against it to prop it shut. It wasn't much warmer than being outside. But of course, there was some break from the wind, and they piled up their bundles of wood to try to make more of a windbreak, and they huddled in their straw raincoats and settled down and tried to sleep as best they could, hoping to take the ferry in the morning. Well, old Mosaku fell asleep right away. Minokichi, though, was listening to the sound of the wind howling, and he felt the shivering of his bones. But finally, even his weary eyes shut, and he slept. Suddenly, he was wide awake. The door was standing wide open. The moonlight was reflecting off the snow, and the snow light was filling the doorway. And there he saw, standing in the doorway of the hut, a woman, a beautiful woman. Her face and her hands and her robe were as white as the snow, clearly seen in that snow light. And her eyes and her hair were blacker than the night. He could hardly believe what he was seeing, and he wondered if it could be true or if it was a mirage of snow and terror. And then, with no movement of hips or legs or feet, the woman silently glided towards old Mosaku. Minokichi wanted to jump up, wanted to cry out, but his limbs were frozen and his voice was like a block of ice in his throat. And he watched in horror as the woman bent from her waist over the old man and breathed. It looked like white smoke, and everywhere that breath touched turned to ice. Then she straightened up, and with no movement of hips or legs or feet, glided silently right to Minokichi. She bent over. Her face, that pale, beautiful face, drew close to his, and a tear crept down his cheek. And then she smiled. And he saw in that beautiful face her teeth, which were as long and sharp and pointed as icicles. And she said, "I shall spare you. You are so young, so pretty. But if ever you tell anyone what happened here tonight, I shall know. And I promise I shall end your life." And she silently glided to the door and disappeared into the snow. Then Minokichi found he could move, and he ran over to the door, and he slammed it shut, and he piled wood against it, and he went back to old Mosaku and reached out his hand and drew back. For the old man was frozen, stark and dead. Minokichi drew his straw coat about him, shivering in the cold. He finally fell asleep, senseless. Well, in the morning, the villagers came. The snowstorm had ended, and they had been searching for, and they did find both of the men in the cabin, both poor old Mosaku and terrorized Minokichi. Back in the village, he told them about the snowstorm and no ferry and the hut and trying to sleep, and that the old man had frozen to death. No word of the Yuki Onna, the snow woman. Well, it took Minokichi a long time to recover from the stress and terror of that night, but he did eventually, and he was able to continue cutting wood and providing for his mother and himself. A year later, on a clear winter's day, Minokichi had once again been out cutting wood, and he was on his way home. He'd come back and cross the river, and on that long path towards the village, well, he came upon a young woman whom he had never seen before, and they struck up a conversation. And she said that her name was Oyuki and that her parents had recently died, and so she was on her way to the city of Yedo, where she had relatives, hoping that they would help her perhaps find a job there as a servant in a fine house. Well, the day was drawing to an end, and Minokichi said to her that it wasn't safe to be traveling on the roads at night. He said, "My mother-in-law and I live on the edge of the village. Why don't you come? My mother will feed us a fine warm meal. You can warm yourself by the fire, spend the night safely in our home, and then be on your way if you must." for she was very beautiful. She was very light of spirit and engaging to talk with. And she accepted his hospitality, and in his home, she and his mother hit it off right away. And they engaged in animated conversation, both the older woman and the younger woman laughing together over the meal. And Minokichi looked at them both and smiled. Well, you can add 2 and 2. It turns out that Oyuki never left. She and Minokichi fell in love. They got married. They had several children together. And Minokichi's mother was delighted to have such a wonderful daughter-in-law. She died about 5 years later, and her last words were words of appreciation and compassion for her beloved daughter-in-law and her son and the grandchildren they had given her. Well, as time went on, Oyuki and Minokichi had 7 children together. And all of the people around in the village and the countryside embraced her as one of their own, although there was something decidedly different about her. For one thing, all the country and peasant women, certainly aged early. And she, as the years passed on, and even though she had had 7 children, well, she didn't seem to age a day beyond that youthful, beautiful young woman who had come home with Minokichi years before. Well, one winter's night, they were seated by the fire. The children were all tucked in bed. Minokichi was carving a bowl. Oyuki was mending one of the children's kimono. And as she was sewing, Minokichi stopped his carving and looked up at her. And something about the angle of her face and the way the firelight shone on it stirred a long forgotten memory. And he gave a loud sigh. Well, Oyuki, without looking up, said, "My husband, what are you sighing about?" And he said, "Looking at you just now, in the firelight, I'm remembering something that happened a long time ago when I saw another woman, the only woman nearly as beautiful as you that I have ever seen, my dear. And I saw her in a certain light. And Oyuki said, "Oh? And will you tell me about her?" And she heard Minokichi talk about that long ago night, talk about the snowstorm and the hut and the Yuki Onna, the snow woman who had frozen the old man. She put the kimono and the needle and thread down, and she stood up. And she silently glided toward Minokichi. "I told you to never tell anyone, and that if you did, I would know and I would end your life." But for the sake of our children, I would do that this instant. Because you have spoken of this, I can no longer stay. I must leave, and I leave our children in your care. Mind that you care for them well. If you ever mistreat them in any way, small or large, I shall know, and I shall return and keep my promise. And she glided to the door. It opened, and she disappeared into the snow. Now Minokichi never saw Oyuki again. And he did care well for their children. He raised them with strength and compassion and generosity. But there were times when he would hear the wind howl and circle round the house in the depths of winter. And in that wind, he could hear a sound that he would swear sounded like a woman's voice. Maybe you've heard it. It is Yuki Onna, grieving for her children. May we raise children well, as Minokichi certainly did after that.
Good job with the
That was
needlework.
beautiful. Thank you.
Nice job. Mesmerizing.
Good job.
Mesmerizing.
So
I can hear you.
Good job. I'm glad I got to hear that.
Thank you. Amazing. Hey.
Oh, that was well done.
Bravo.
So much. We don't usually do ghost stories in February, do we?
Thank you.
Oh, my goodness.
Anyone else need
Mesmerized.
hot cocoa and a blanket after that? Anyone else want hot cocoa and a blanket after
Uh, hey friends, I muted all again as we move forward. Pam, you're welcome to unmute. I muted you. Thank you so much, Pam. So we have reached the cold portion of the evening, as it were. Thank you so much. I love that story. Tell us a little bit about your weekly telling on Facebook. I know that you've been doing that.
I have been, as we've all been living through this pandemic, something that I started last summer, trying to put a little light out into the world. And that's what I've been saying from the beginning, not just because that's part of our theme tonight. But every Friday, I've had a couple of bumps in the schedule, but almost every single Friday, 11 a.m. Mountain Time, I'm on Facebook Live and I do live storytelling. It's usually one, sometimes two traditional tales, multicultural global tales from various places around the world. And if you don't catch it live, the recordings are available publicly on my Facebook page. And I think that link will be sent to you in a follow-up email. So if you wanted to, you don't have to be friends with me on Facebook, and you can come get some live storytelling on Fridays if you like.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, moving forward. So I had someone pop a question about this here in the chat. If you are seeing chat pop up over your video, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a series of buttons, one of which should say chat. If you don't see it there, there should be 3 little dots under which say more. And if you click the chat, it should open the chat on the side of your screen. And that way you do not get pop-ups over your actual over the video as it is playing. That's a useful thing to do. I think the chat function is a new and interesting way of audience interaction, and I'm not yet all the way towards telling people don't chat during stories. So I'm sorry if it is being a little distracting for people. I find if it is out of the corner of my eye, I am more comfortable. Phyllis, I see you have raised your hand. We will do Q&A at the end if you have questions, but I'm gonna ask, oh, no, your hand went down. If you do have a problem though, if you would message either Rachel or Stephanie Treader, our other co-hosts, they should be able to help you out with it. So now that we've gotten through the cold of the evening, we're gonna work our way back to warmth. So this story is one of those gems of the Brothers Grimm that no one knows about. We have sort of this, most people can name 5 or 10 Brothers Grimm stories, but there's about 200 of them. And so there is a world where we go into them and we find them. And a couple of years ago, I read all of the Brothers Grimm's in a couple of different translations, which was a lot because some of them are real special. But this story I found and I loved. And so I'm really hopeful to share it with you today. The old man looked out the window of his study. Across his fields beneath that leaden February sky, everything his eyes fell upon belonged to him. The fields with the small shoots of winter wheat just creeping up, his men hard at work there, the orchards, his barns filled with last year's harvest, the stables of fine horses. But then he felt it again. The tapping in his heart, that irregular tapping, and nothing the doctors could do, no matter how much money you threw at them. They were worthless. It all came down to this. He had more money. He had more money than he knew what to do with. He'd never give it to charity. None of that. He had kept his money close. And now you couldn't pay the doctors to fix this. His mind and its wandering was interrupted by a rapping on his door. He turned to see his steward enter. Sir, you have a visitor. The steward stepped back, and a poor man, a farmer from down the road, the old man recognized. He twisted his hat in his hand as he stood there. The old man looked him down. Too many children, not enough land, not enough money. What do you want? The poor man trembled. Sir, I will not ask charity from you, for I know you give none. Charity, there's no money in that. What do you want? Sir, God has blessed your fields. Your harvest was fine, but mine was poor, sir. And I have no grain to feed my children, sir. And I would pay whatever terms you ask for grain to see my children through the winter, sir. The old man looked the poor farmer up and down. But then he felt it again, that tapping on his chest. And maybe a little shard of the ice on his heart had broken away. A pale, wan bit of sunlight struck him there, but he looked the young farmer in the eyes. I will not bargain with you, but I will offer you a deal. Go to my barn, take the finest wagon you like, and hitch to it as many horses as you can. My men will load as much grain as will fit into the wagon, if you will do what I ask. The poor man trembled. And what would you ask, sir? This, that when I die, you sit 3 nights upon my grave, that you do not move for man or God, that you hold the watch from sundown to cockcrow for 3 nights. Do we have a deal? The poor man looked around the room. This didn't seem to be a joke. Yes, sir, yes, I have little, but you have my word, sir. and they shook on it. My steward will see to the particulars. The poor man shook his head as he left the old miser's study. He shook his head as he watched a fine new cart, 4 beautiful horses be loaded with sack after sack of grain. He could barely contain his shock, his laughter, as he pulled into his own barnyard to see the eyes of his wife grow wide. What did you trade? And he laughed. No, come, let me put away the horses and I will tell you. When he told her the story, she laughed as well. He's gone mad. He's senile. What can he possibly... But horses and grain, we'll take that. And they had food and new horses. And as luck would have it, it was 1 week later that the old man died. And at that old miser's funeral, there were few people. His heirs were more interested in dividing up his estate between them, cutting up his land, breaking open his strong boxes. And he had not in his will even left money for a gravestone. He was buried in one far corner of the churchyard, a simple mound of earth over him. And that poor farmer stood in his kitchen. He had gone to the service. He felt like he should have. And his wife there wrapped bread and cheese and put it into a basket, put it into his hands. One of his children handed him a bundle of sticks. It is lucky it is not snowing, Papa. He ruffled her hair. But he took the blanket his elder daughter gave him. He pulled his coat tight, and he made his way through their village. As the sun began to set, he entered the churchyard. The shadows of the graves were long. He made his way through, and he saw it, that mound of fresh earth. He laid out his blanket. He sat himself down. He kindled a fire. And at each hoot from an owl or some badger snuffling in the bracken, he started, but he let himself calm down. And he found it wasn't so bad. It was warm enough with the fire. He had some bread and cheese. It was not so often he got a night to sit by himself. He smoked his pipe. He kept himself awake, and the night passed. And the next day he slept, and that next night he bundled a few more sticks for a slightly bigger fire, and he settled in for a second night, and again, it was not so bad. It was the third night. He was almost looking forward to it. It had been 3 nights. He had not worked those days. He had had fine nights with his own thoughts. And he laid out his blanket there on the grave where he was accustomed to sitting. The sun, it set. He had just begun to build up the sticks of the fire when he heard it. From the brambles off to his right, he heard a moan and a groan, and he stood up. He parted the bracken and he looked, and there was a fresh dug open grave just beyond, and from it a thing, a creature began to emerge. It had a broad brimmed hat, a long coat, and it moaned out, and he could smell the stink of cheap wine on its breath. He stumbled back, and as the light of his fire caught the man's face, he saw he had a long drooping mustache, scars on his face as his coat blew back, the hilt of an old sword, and tall, high top boots like a soldier would wear. The soldier looked up. "What are you doing here?" I was going to ask you the same thing." "Well, you see, I lost my horse at cards. He's a good horse, but he's not mine no more. And there was no money for the inn, and I saw the grave, and I thought I'd sleep there as well as anywhere else. They'll use it later. What about yourself?" Well, the poor man tried to explain. He'd sworn, he'd shook on it, he'd given his word of honor to sit 3 nights, stand watch on this grave from sundown to cockcrow. To stand watch. I've stood watch in many a worse place than this. Flying snow, why, the air's just crisp here. Soldier looked beyond the poor man. "Is that bread and cheese? Why, I would give you, my man, my word of honor that I will stand the watch with you in exchange for half your bread and cheese, lest all the hosts of hell come against us from sundown to cockcrow. And I have myself about me some wine I'd share with you in the bargain." The poor man laughed. He helped the soldier out of the grave, and he sat himself down beside. They carved the bread and cheese. They handed it back and forth. The soldier produced 4 bottles of wine, cracked one, and the 2 men fell into laughing and talking there. And the hours began to pass. And then the clock began to toll midnight, and through the churchyard a fog began to spread. And down that pathway of stone they saw him come. A tall, slender fellow with a broad hat and a red feather that shone there in the moonlight. His long coat sweeping the stone beside him, they heard the tap, tap, tap of his walking stick and the click, click, click of the cloven hooves beneath the coat. And the devil himself stood before them and looked them up and down. "My ruffians, a midnight picnic in a graveyard is it? Be away with you. The man below you belongs to me." And the poor man, he felt ice run down his spine. He felt his arms begin to tremble, but the soldier clapped him on the shoulder. "My lord of the red feather, you are welcome. But you are not my captain, and I take no orders from any other. We have sworn to God Almighty to hold our post upon this ground till the cock crow, and we shall not be moved, for there was bread and cheese in the bargain." The devil smiled. He tapped his own pocket. "My men, I have about me some quantity of gold, and for it, could you not hold your watch on a different grave?" But the soldier, he smiled back. "Sir, it'll take more than your pocket money to see us move. No, why? I have an idea." And the soldier began to work at his boot until he had produced the tall top boot, and his toes, they stunk to high heaven. He held up his boot. "Sir, you fill my boot with gold, and we shall see our watch somewhere else." The devil eyed the soldier's boot. It was rather large, but the devil was owed a favor by the money changer in the next town over, and so he smiled. "Then we are agreed, and I will see you shortly." He turned and disappeared into the darkness, and when he'd gone, the soldier began to laugh, but the poor man shook. To make a deal with the devil? There's nothing to it. I've met far worse than him. Have you met the king? The devil's nothing. Give me your cheese knife. And with the cheese knife, he began to work the sole and the heel from off his boot. These he removed. He propped the boot up against the brambles beside them, and the poor man realized that the open end stood over that fresh dug grave beyond. They opened the second bottle of wine, and they were well into the third when they saw the mist rise. Again, the clock tolled 2, and down the pathway they saw him come. He was hunched over the bag of gold on his shoulder. It had taken rather longer than he'd wished to walk back, but he put down the sack. "There's your gold, my men." The soldier smiled. "Pour away, good sir, pour away, and we shall see." The devil untied the top of the bag, and he began to pour the gold down and down and down, but the boot did not fill. "You see, sir, I have rather large feet. It's been commented on before." The devil glared at them. "Be off, sir, or we shall hold our post the while yet." The devil turned and disappeared into the darkness, and the 2 men began to laugh. The clock was tolling 4 when the mist rose again. They saw him coming down the lane, that bag bigger still on his back and his fury on his face. He had had to pawn his stick, his hat, his coat, his waistcoat, his watch. And he put down the bag. "There you are, fellows, there you are. Pour away, good cinder keeper, pour away." And down and down and down he poured the gold, but the boot would not fill. "You, sir, have unconscionably large thighs." "It is the truth," I was born that way, sir, but you owe us more gold. Be away. And the devil, he stomped his hoof, and he was away, for he had no power there within the churchyard. The gray of the eastern sky had just begun to lighten when they saw him come again. He was dragging behind him a sack near his own size, and the fury on his face was evident. For he had had to sign away the soul of the money changer, that letter in his pocket, literally burning a hole in the cloth. And he drew up. Pour away, your sootiness, pour away. And as the devil began to pour those gold coins down into the boot, the poor man tried to maintain a reverent fear of the devil while discovering snorting wine up one's nose is not the most pleasant way to do so. But the gold, they trickled down and down, but the boot would not fill. The devil turned, his face filling with fury, smoke literally pouring out of his ears and nose. But what he would have done to them, we shall never know. For in that moment, just in that moment, there came a crow of the cock, and they saw the sun begin to rise. And the devil, he stomped his foot. He disappeared in a cloud of sulfur that smelled worse than the soldier's toes. And the two men began to laugh there on that grave mound. The poor man rose. He pulled back the bracken, and the grave, it is near full of gold, my friend. Why, half of this is yours. You're welcome to stay with us until you find a house you like for yourself. Why, with this gold. And the soldier just laughed. Oh, my friend, no. I'll fill one of these here sacks and take it with. If I had that much gold, I'd just lose it at cards or drink. I'll buy back my horse. He's a good enough horse. And I'll be on my way. But what part you would give to me, my friend, share among other poor fellows like yourselves, farmers, crofters, fisher folk, the like, that could use a spot of something. They shook there, and the soldier, he filled a small bag with gold. He put it over one shoulder and his boot over the other. And the last that farmer saw of him was his silhouette disappearing into the rising sun, staggering away to find his horse. But the poor man, he was as good as his handshake. And with that gold, he bought a fine house and land from that old miser's rich estates. And he raised up a fine family there, but he was always known. He gave gold to all, to farmers, to fisher folk, any who needed it. You had but to ask, and often not even that. The money was there. But the strangest thing he did, often commented on by his friends and other fellows at church, there was that one grave at the far back of the churchyard that he had the brambles cleared away. He had flowers planted there. He had a marble stone placed at its head. And when his friends, they teased him, you know the old miser buried there. He's down in hell. The devil has him, you know. The farmer was just like to shake his head. I don't think so. I think he might have had some intercession, and so may we all hope to have someday.
Bravo. Bravo.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Good job.
Thank you, Cooper.
Fabulous, fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Fun, what fun.
Wait, no, just let me.
I am gonna make it rain in your. No. Wow.
Thank you so much. All right.
Come
Moving
on, Cooper,
forward.
make it rain.
All right. We're going to mute all again. And it is you once more.
I think we all now have learned many lessons. Like when cheese is part of a bargain, you do not break it. Cheese is very important. Long ago in Kenya, there was a rich man. He had a daughter who was of marrying age. Whether or not she was beautiful, we don't know. She was far too rich for us to really determine how beautiful she was, but every man who courted her said she was quite the beauty. There were many who wished to be her husband, But she only had eyes for the poor young man. Isn't that the way? And her father was not having it, which is also the way. But he couldn't say no to her, at least not directly. He avoided it as much as possible. And so when he saw how many suitors she had, this young man among them, he devised a test. He said, if any man could stand in that cold lake near their village all night long, if a man could stand from dusk till dawn in that lake, well, he would be able to marry the young woman. Now, the young man heard this and his heart had hope for the first time. His heart had hope. He went to his mother. He said, I'm going tonight with all those other suitors. I will stand in the lake all night long with them. Oh, his mother was not so sure about this. You are my only son. That lake is cold. It is visited by wild animals all night long. If you die, what will I have? There are so many other young women that do not require such a test. They would just ask you to visit them a few times and you could have a wife. But the young man was sure of what he wanted. And so with his mother's blessing or no, he was going to stand in that lake. And so that night, as the sun began to set, he set off down towards the lake. And when he reached it, he saw heads, many heads sticking out of the water. It was as if there were stepping stones strewn throughout the lake. And he could hear these men talking and boasting and laughing at each other. He passed by the servants who were sitting on the hill. They were tasked to sit there all night long to make sure if anyone did stay in the lake, that they would be able to report it to their master in the morning. They had warm blankets. They were sitting next to each other, and the young man nodded as he walked by. He took a step into the lake, and oh, it was nice and cool. It had been hot that day. His skin was warm and appreciated the cool water as he waded in. But the further he went in, the colder that lake got. Soon his feet were feeling chilly, but he waded in until he was up to his neck with all the other men. And the sun, it set, and the moon began to rise. At first, there was a lot of chatting. Those men boasting to one another how long they would stay and who would give up first. But as the cold set in, a few of the men decided that there were some very pretty girls in the village who would take a little less effort to woo. And they were the first ones to pull themselves out, to warm up their legs by rubbing them on the shore, and then making their way home. Those who were left in the lake shouted after them, and then they were quiet again. As the moon floated overhead, a herd of antelope came to drink at the lake. Those men could see the silhouettes of their sharp horns against the sky. And soon a head went up, and all the antelopes were looking about, and then they ran away into the dark. Soon after they were gone, they could hear the laughter of the hyenas, cackling and yowling. Some hyenas did not even make it to the lake until a few other men decided to pull themselves out, rub their legs off, and make their way back into town. Those who stayed bunched towards the middle as the hyenas came and circled the lake with their eyes glowing, laughing as they took a drink of water. But soon the hyenas, they too ran, because to the water's edge came the lions, with their low rumbles that rippled across the water, with their eyes that stared at those men even as they drank. Once the lions had left, a few other men got out. And then there were only a few left, including that young man who was still standing there trying to keep himself upright, using his hands to sweep that water away around his body so he could stay afloat because his legs were so numb. And when the snake joined them in the water, well, many men left then too. And the young man who found his way into the middle of the lake away from the snakes realized he was the last one. And the servants on the shore, are you going to get out too? Because if you are, we'd like to go home and get a good night's sleep. The young man didn't respond. He just continued to stay in the water, sweeping that water around him to keep himself upright. And the moon sailed over and set. And in that darkness, even with all the stars, he could feel his heart becoming cold. Maybe this was too much. Maybe he would drown, and then he would be of no use to her anyway. And just as he was starting to try to find his toes to make his way through the lake, a spark, a little spark of fire, and then a little flame on the hill 40 paces away. He looked at that little spark, that flame. Somebody was making a fire, feeding it with bits and pieces until that fire that came from hell, was lit on the hill. He could see there was someone beside it. It had to be. Somebody had lit that fire. He couldn't make out who they were, but there's something about that flame that warmed his heart, though he was still so cold. And he stilled himself in the water, and he fixed his eyes on that flame. And all night long, that person fed that little fire and fed it to keep it big enough and bright enough. And he kept looking at it until he realized the sky was becoming brighter. And the servants on the shore were leaning forward with interest. Who was this man who had made it all night long? They were starting to shout encouragement. Not long, not long. The sun will come up soon. And it did. When those first rays struck the water of the lake, the young man began to push his way towards shore, pulling himself up. And when his toes left the water, the servants were there. You made it. You made it. You won the challenge. We will tell our master. And they took off. The young man massaged the life back into his legs. And then he stood and looked around. There was that little fire. There was the figure underneath the blanket. And he walked to the fire and he looked at that figure. Mother, thank you. And his mother looked up at him. She threw dirt on the fire. Let's go get you a wife. Together they walked to the rich man's house, and the rich man was there, but he was not smiling, though you might expect that. No, but he was not agreeable either. You may have won the test, but you cheated. My servants told me exactly what happened. That fire on the hill kept you warm in the lake all night. The young man had no words, but his mother did. That fire was 40 paces away. There is no way that would have kept him warm. And the two of them argued back and forth, and the young woman started to cry, and the young man looked like he was going to, but was trying to hold it together, and they decided to take the matter to the judge. Well, by this time, the whole town was invested on the outcome of this story. And so they came with them to the judge's house, and the judge sat and listened and nodded his head. A fire, you say, that would keep a person warm in a lake. 40 paces is what you said? And the judge went into his house and found a big pot and put it out in front of his house. And he said, count with me. And together he counted with the village 40 paces away. And there the judge built a fire. He called back to the mother, is this about how big your fire was? Yes, it was. The judge came back and sat down and looked at the village. Now, we'll see how long it takes for that fire to warm this pot of water. It took only a few minutes, what it's taken you a few seconds to realize. Everybody began to laugh, and the rich man had no more arguments. And that young woman jumped into her husband's arms. They were married, and their hearts were always as warm as that fire that his mother built on the hill for her son.
Yay!
Hey, that was thank you very much.
Fortune.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yay,
Wonderful.
moms!
Yay, moms.
Let's go get you a wife. Very nice.
Next up, we have one more from Pam.
Wow.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, this is usually about 8 minutes long. I'll try to tighten it a little bit because we're going past 7:30. But if you have to leave, there's going to be recording available, right? Anne, Cooper? Okay.
Yes. Here, let me find myself and I will add in here. Come on. Okay, this is being fascinating.
Cooper, do you want to do the mute for everybody real quick?
Sure. Steph, can you see if you can spotlight me? Zoom is, the glory of this strange program is that there are times when it updates and there are new things available, and I don't seem to be able to spotlight myself. So you just get to hear my voice and look at our lovely Nexteller. Thank you so much, Steph. The answer is we are recording, and once I get the recording set up and I upload it, you will all get an email probably late tonight or early tomorrow with a link to the recording. It's an unlisted YouTube, so you can't search for it on YouTube, but with the link you can go there. You're all welcome to, again, I know that people have to leave. Sometimes internet is a little odd, so yes, there's certainly a recording and everybody will have it. We have one last story for you tonight. We're going a little longer than normal, but the joy of Zoom is that you are able to step away if you need to. Right? So Pam, would you bring us home?
Gladly. And actually, we're going a little bit home for me. We're going to a country and a culture where trying to find and create fire and warmth in the midst of cold and dark has impacted the very country and culture itself, and that is Norway. And I say going home because that's where my grandparents are from. So here's a story for us from Norway to close out the night. Now, Greta and her mother were poor. They lived in a small, snug house, and they really only had an old hen who laid the occasional egg and a stony garden in which to grow some vegetables and each other. Now, one winter's day, the wind was gusting about the house. That north wind was making the shutters rattle some. And the midday sun that was low in the sky in Norway was shining weakly through the windows. And they were warming their fingers and toes by the fire. And Greta's mother sighed and said, "My dear, however are we to make it through this winter? We've no money for food or firewood." Well, Greta, who was by nature cheerful and optimistic, said, "Don't worry, Mother. Let me make us some hot soup, and then we can think together." So she went over to the cupboard and was dismayed to find that there was not so much as a carrot left in the cupboard. Well, undeterred, she put on her coat and scarf and mittens and headed outside to go to the storehouse, telling her mother, "I'll go see. I think we have some flour left out in the storehouse." Well, thankfully, the wind had calmed, so she just stepped out into the cold winter day, headed across the few steps across the dirt yard to the storehouse, went inside, and she looked in the jar and was relieved to find there was some flour still in the bottom. She thought, "There's enough here for me to make a pan of hot biscuits." So she poured the flour into the pan that she had brought with her, and then she set it upright, put the top back on, stepped out the storehouse's steps, began across that dirt yard, when back came a gust of the north wind and whooshed the flour right out of the pan into the air. "Hey," she said, "that's not right." So quickly popping her head in to tell her mother what she was up to, she headed off after the north wind. And she headed northward. She passed humps of snow and patches of ice and broken branches and more snow and ice and branches. And finally, northward and onward, she came to a cave at the foot of the North Mountain. And she knew that was the home of the north wind. So bold as can be, she stepped right inside, and North Wind was home, calm and resting. Good day. Is there something I can help you with? Well, good day, said Greta. And yes, kindly return the flour that you took. If I don't get that back, my mother and I will have nothing to eat today. And well, we are out of food. North Wind replied, oh, that won't do at all. I'm afraid I cannot return the flour. I don't have it. But let me give you something else. And North Wind brought forth a plain white cloth and gave it to Greta, saying, you need only spread this cloth on any surface. Say, feed me, and you shall have appearing before you as much food as you shall ever need. And Greta thought, well, that's a good exchange. So she thanked the North Wind, tucked the cloth under her arm, and headed back home. But she had traveled too far and had grown too late. There was no way she could make it all the way back home for the night. So she remembered she had passed an inn on the way, and she made her way to it. She could see the light through the windows, and she made her way to the inn, opened up the door, stepped inside. Oh, and the warmth of the people and the fire drew her in. And so she booked a room for the night, and she said, I don't need to purchase a meal, thank you. And she seated herself in a far back corner of the common room, and she spread out her white cloth on her table. And she said the words that I think I forgot to tell you. Did I tell you that North Wind told her she had to say the words, feed me? Well, she looked at the cloth and she gave it a try. She said, feed me. And there appeared before her potatoes and sausages and bread and cheese and apples. Oh, it was a bounty. She ate her fill. And across the common room, the innkeeper and his wife had seen what had happened. The innkeeper looked at his wife, and that night, while Greta was sleeping, the wife tiptoed into Greta's room. She had a plain white cloth of her own, and she swapped it with the one Greta had. The next morning, Greta got up, put the cloth under her arm, headed home. When she got there, Mother, she burst in, I have something here that will give us as much food as ever we shall need. And the mother said, I will believe that when I see it. And so Greta spread out the cloth on their table, and she said, feed me. Feed me. Feed me. And of course, nothing happened. Oh, that's not right, she said. She picked up the cloth, put it under her arm, had her coat and scarf and mittens back on, and headed out northwards again. She passed by all those humps of snow and patches of ice and broken branches and came to that cave at the base of the North Mountain. Still bold as can be, she stepped right inside, and North Wind was home. Good day. What have we here? Good day, said Greta. This cloth you gave me, it worked fine at the end, but I took it home and it won't produce any food at all. I dare say that is not the cloth that I gave you. But here I have something else. And he brought forth a brown goat. Take this goat. You need only to say to it, make gold. and it shall. Well, Greta thought, well, that's a fine exchange. So she thanked the north wind and took the goat by the little halter and headed on out. But of course, it was, again, too far and too late. She couldn't make it home. So she headed back to that same inn. She stepped inside, she booked her room, and ordered a meal for the night. She found her way back to that same table in the corner of the common room. And when she thought no one was looking, she said to the goat, "Make gold." And out of the goat's mouth dropped a half dozen gold coins. Well, of course, the innkeeper and his wife had been watching her from across the way. And the innkeeper looked at his wife. And that night, when Greta was asleep, the innkeeper went and exchanged a brown goat of his own out in the stable with the goat that Greta had from the north wind. Well, the next morning she got up and she went out to the stable, and I don't know exactly why, maybe they were that similar. She didn't notice that a swap had been made, and she took hold of the halter of that brown goat and she headed on home. "Mother," she said when she got home, "I have a goat that will give us as much gold as ever we shall need." And the mother said, "Oh, I'll believe that when I see it." So Greta said, "Make gold. Make gold. Make gold." But the only thing that came out of that goat's mouth was a bleat and nothing more. "That's not right," said Greta. So she took the goat back. And as she entered the cave of the North Wind said, "Good day." And Greta said, "Good day. This goat, I took it home and it won't give the gold at home." "Well," said North Wind, "that is not the goat that I gave you. But here is something else for you." And North Wind brought forth a broom. Greta took hold of the broom, and North Wind said, "You need only say, 'Sweep, broom,' and this broom shall sweep away your troubles." Well, that's a fair exchange, thought Greta, for she had an idea of just where the source of her troubles was. So she headed on back and, of course, headed straight for the inn. As she went in, she booked a room and a meal. And as she was eating, the innkeeper looked at his wife and said, "That broom must be worth something." So that night, when they were sure that she was sound asleep, the innkeeper tiptoed into her room with his own broom, and just as he was about to swap it, Greta sat bolt upright and said, "Sweep, broom," and the broom began to sweep and beat and beat and sweep and beat against the innkeeper. He went running out of her room, crying out, and there was his wife, and he began to sweep and beat against his wife as well, and they were wailing and calling out, saying, "We're sorry. Take your goat, take your cloth, but call this broom off of us." And so Greta thought, that's an excellent exchange. She left the broom with them, was in possession of the rightful cloth and the rightful goat that she had been given by the North Wind, and headed home. And once she got home, oh, I am telling you that cloth produced bountifully for Greta and her mother, and the goat produced faithfully. And so they made it just fine, snug in their house, warm by their fire, not only through the rest of the winter, but to tell you the truth, they really did, thanks to the gifts of the North Wind, live happily ever after.
Bravo. Nice
Nice job, Pam.
Oh, well done as always.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Great.
Fantastic.
Oh.
Hey.
Thank you.
Great.
Great fun.
Great stories.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you. Awesome.
Sweet story.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to mute all one more time here. I have a couple of last quick announcements, and then if you would like to stay around and chat with us, we will stick around for a little while to chat, mostly until we all get tired and need to go away. Last couple of things. people have asked about recordings. A recording will be sent out probably late tonight or early tomorrow. You're welcome to it. If you feel that the art that you experienced here tonight was worth something to you, we would love you to show that to us. This is a pay what it's worth show. If it was worth $5, if it was worth $50, whatever you like. The email you will all have received probably just about right now includes PayPal, Zelle, Venmo. If checks work well for you, we also accept check. There's my address is in there. And again, please, Cooper-Braun LLC or Cooper-Braun-Enos, Stories with Spirit is not a legal entity. That said, all of the money will be equally divided between all of the tellers. It's just easier to bring it all into one place. Lastly, Anne and I have a show on March 13th. That is our next in our English Cooper. I can actually talk. That's what I'm here for. Fairy Tale Variations, which is 5 tellers, each doing a very different take on one classic fairy tale. The first 2 have been immensely fun. Rumpelstiltskin plans to be really, really interesting, and a link to that is also in the email that you will soon all be receiving. That said, I'm going to bring Pam and Anne back up here, and you are all welcome to unmute yourselves if you like. Thank you all so very much for coming. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is a strange time, and it's so cool that we still get to do storytelling, and it weirdly still really works, but it doesn't work without you all being here. Otherwise, I'm a guy sitting in my basement talking to the wall, and you make this possible. So thank you all so much for being here.
We're just so glad y'all can do this, and we can get to hear and see you, and it's just great.
Yes, and it's lovely to hear you, Pam. I haven't ever heard you before. We've been listening to Cooper and Rachel, but you were a wonderful addition.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and joy to be here with the 2 of them and with all y'all. Thank you.
Pam is a good friend of ours, and the Snow Woman is one of those stories that, like, oh man.
Yeah.
Oh man.
The sewing. I'm like, that is like, she's really sewing.
Oh yeah.
Those were great stories too. Yeah. I thoroughly enjoyed you.
Cooper, you need to read your mom's comment.
I'll have to find it. Yes, and I do oh yes. Yes. Indeed. Yeah, it's
Comments. Don't make us.
so in the Grimm's version of what's it? I'm blanking on the name of it. He gets the blanket, he gets the cloth that brings food, and then he gets a donkey. And in the original Grimm's, the donkey is generating gold from a different orifice, shall we say. And then he gets a cudgel, and the cudgel solves the problem of the innkeeper. But my mom was commenting, my great-grandmother told my mother fairy tales in English, I think, but is from Germany. And my mother grew up on a lot of the Grimm's fairy tales, in the kind that kept her up probably longer than she should have been in terror, because there is some degree of terrify the children with the fairy tale.
Very graphic.
So.
Can I say something to Pam?
Please.
Yeah, Pam, I think you would be a wonderful actress. If you ever got tired of storytelling, you can go right into the theater, because your emotions, your voice changes, your face changes. I mean, I am there. And
yeah. Bless your heart. Thanks. And of course, as you know, there's a lot of overlap and kinship between storytelling and acting, for sure.
But, yeah, but storytelling's more lucrative.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Please tell us more.
I did theater for a year, and I made more money doing one storytelling show than I did for the whole year of theater.
As a theater professional, I may wish to discuss something with whoever your business manager for those whatever company you work for, but
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Could you quickly review each story and tell their origin? Because I got the impression that some of them were written by some of you and some of them were traditional.
Shall we go in order?
Yes.
So Saint Anthony and the Pig, or Saint Anthony in Hell, I don't remember its original name. I found it in some Italian folktale collection. It's probably post 1600 Italian folktale. Anne, do you want to bounce?
Well, Cooper may be so precise about that. Mine is a Russian fairy tale. It's called The 12 Months. And there's a couple variations out there, but it's a fairy tale.
And Snow Woman or Yuki Onna is a well-known story figure, legendary figure in Japanese lore. And you can find lots of versions of it in books and online.
The Grave Mound is, I think, Grimm Story 196. It only appears in the second edition. It's not in the first edition, but it's Brothers Grimm story. There's a 1700. I was doing some research on this recently. There's a 1700 story that they seem to have drawn some of it from, but it's mostly the Brothers Grimm's is the earliest we find it.
The man in the lake or standing in the lake, there's a couple different versions. There's actually versions of it that I think I've heard an Irish version of the young man standing in the lake. I've heard a number of them, but I did find one that was placed in Kenya and went with that one for my telling of the story. But there's that version is from Kenya.
Because I've been with you folks a couple times now, and when you do some of your own stories, I end up thinking that they're traditional ones anyways, because it's so wonderfully, themed.
Well, so one of the things, and then as Pam said at the beginning of her story, the Gifts from the North Wind is Norwegian.
And it's usually you usually find in collections as the Lad and the North Wind, but we had Greta in there instead.
A lot of
way to go, girl.
A lot of the best metaphor. I don't know if Janice is with us. Janice Del Negro, who has been a mentor to both Anne and myself and is an amazing storyteller in her own right, has a metaphor about freeze-dried soup, which I just love. That many of these stories, we find them in collections, and they're like freeze-dried soup. They're pretty sparse, because when someone is collecting, especially in days when you're writing it while someone's telling, you're probably not getting it word for word. And there was a lot of editing going on. And so when we get them, they're often pretty sparse. And my metaphor is you look at the freeze-dried soup and you say, okay, there's corn and there's carrots. So you go and get fresh corn and maybe you roast the corn. And then you go and get fresh carrots and you chop them up and you go and make broth. And I think in the best way, you're trying to recreate a recipe. And sometimes you add in a little spice because we're in the Southwest and we like a little spice here. And you add some things and you add and you play, or you decide that one of your people, you don't like beef. So you swap the beef for chicken. And we can run with the metaphor as much as we like, but there's a lot about making the stories our own. And that, I tell a version of a Grimm story called Bearskin, or The Devil in the Green Coat, which I set during Vietnam. And it's basically the Grimm story. I've changed very little of it. But people assume, and yes, I wrote it. It is my version of that story, but the core of that story is the Brothers Grimm's. So did I write it? Did the Brothers Grimm's write it? Did I adapt the fairy tale? There's a bunch of different ways to talk about it, but a lot of what we do is bring life to stories that when they collect, you read fairy tale collections, and many of them are very dry.
That's true.
Well, and some of them, especially if you know the patterns of stories, like for mine, you have the 3, Marukla goes out 3 times. I don't need to describe that to you every single time. So once you have one journey, then you can shorthand the second and the third one, because you already have created the space in your mind. You have already imagined her walking up the mountain and what the men look like. And so I don't need to tell you what that looks like again. I can just shorthand you there. And it's also important so you don't get bored in the middle of the story. But using different aspects of knowing that the audience is with you and where they're going in the story makes it easier to craft these in a way that then, like in the the fairy tale variations, we then say everybody knows the story now. Now we're going to tinker with it in a couple different ways.
And my first thought of the North Wind story was that it was going to be from Texas. But they probably need a story like that right now.
Fair enough. Oh.
Well, thanks so much, everybody. It
Thank
was such a pleasure to hear you all again.
Thank you so much for coming,
And you
Colleen.
just get better and better and better.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
It's good to see you, Colleen and George.
Good to see you. Bye.
Good to
Bye.
Yes, I think Zoom is
Thank you
becoming
very much.
Thank you so much.
Inspiring. It really was wonderful.
Yeah, we should go too.
Well done, everybody.
Thank you, Ed.
Ed, it was good to see you.
Yeah.
Great
You're
to see you
so
guys.
backlit. You're a little witness protection program, Ed.
Yeah, that's me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Being here. Oh, there's
I
Ed.
had a quick comment I wanted to share.
Nice work tonight.
Thank you.
Interestingly enough, we here in Boulder, Colorado, had a snowstorm that was just starting briefly. As you guys, sorry about the backlight of this.
No worries.
Got one in the dark and one in the light.
Yeah.
Perfectly
There we
fixed
go.
and seen.
Yeah, we had a snowstorm of big fat snowflakes as you guys were starting the storytelling. So it was kind of fun.
Oh. I'll have to go look outside to see if it's up here yet.
Yeah, I don't know if it was just a quick brush through or not, but
Yeah, it's here. I can see it out the window.
oh, cool.
For those of you that don't live in Colorado,
Adrian.
if it's going to snow here, it smells like Greeley, Colorado, which smells like feedlot. And so there's a very distinct smell in the air when the when the wind is coming down from the north, and you know you're about to get snow because that's what Greeley smells like.
Hey, Cooper, only a half inch here in Lafayette.
All right, that's good to know. I mean, I don't think we're supposed to get much, but I was checking the mail earlier today. I was like, oh, snow will be here tonight.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't know if we're really going anywhere right now.
As long as the power stays on.
I always laugh in the first line of Gilmore Girls in that first episode when she's like, "It smells like snow," and I'm like, "This is set in Connecticut, right? Like, not the Front Range of Colorado, right?"
Yeah, it doesn't smell like that everywhere.
Oh.
I have a question for Pam. Your stories, they seemed like less known variants of more well-known counterparts. Like when you were telling about the Japanese snow woman, I can't pronounce her name right now, and butcher it, but it reminded me of an Irish telling where he married a Fey woman. Only in her case, yeah, and then with the second one, like Cooper brought up, it reminded me of another story. So it was interesting. There was a sense of familiarity, but it was so different at the same time that it was new. Was that intentional on your part?
Well, I really was. First of all, let me back up that you just touched on one of the joys and thrills of the complexities of traditional tales. I mean, there are motifs and there are themes that are found almost universally. And it's interesting. So is this something that's common to all cultures, or is this something that's so different in each culture? And there are no clear lines. And so that's what you are articulating right now. For me, I simply initially I mean, I've been aware of like Selkie stories from Scotland, which are similar to the changing of the white from one form into another. But I came across this book, this story of the Snow Woman, originally in a book that my brother had given me years ago, and liked it and started looking up other versions and variants of it, and just have stuck with the Japanese version. And again, I was just looking for a story from my own ethnic background, which is I'm 50% Norwegian, and I came across the one of the lad in the North Wind, and I liked it and wanted to make it Greta. So that's it.
Great selections. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comments.
Pam, I'd like to just say I really was impressed very much with the use of your body gliding towards the camera, away from it. That's the act.
Oh, good.
I can see you gliding without. Beautiful.
Well, like Cooper was saying, we're all having to learn how to do all kinds of things differently, and here we storytellers have been thrust into learning how to do this, or sort of not storytelling, right? This whole last year. And after 30 some years, I'm not ready to give up. So we're learning how to do this. And I have fun playing with that, with proximity to the camera and in the box that we are. So we're learning how to do this, right?
That was,
yes, and the eyes.
I mean, that's, I think, to riff on Pam. First of all, Pam, the glide was, you do creepy really well, and I mean that in all goodness. You do creepy real well. But one of the things that's really incredible about Zoom is that my relationship, if I look at any of you, it's basically as if you're sitting across a table from me.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, we can see one another's faces in a way the closest audience member in a live show is 10 feet is close.
Yeah.
We have a sort of a joke in the theater that if you can't see the problem from 30 feet away, it doesn't really matter because you don't get people that close. Don't care about that paint on the wall. No one notices it. But we suddenly have this moment where it's like, you can see a twitch of a smile. You can see my eyebrows. Suddenly I could do things with them. And like, you have the ability to, Pam, it's obviously been working on it. You're doing some stuff with sort of which cheek you're turning towards and what are you doing with your face that, I mean, I think where I came from with this is that we could either rail against the fact that I no longer have hips because I stand in one place on stage, but I talk a lot with my hips and I talk a lot with my hands. And I could rail against the fact I don't have hips and hands anymore, or I could figure out what I could do with my face. Because one path lies to madness and one path lies to actually doing art. So
Your hips don't lie, Cooper.
but you can't see them. They could be lying to you right now.
But it impacts what your upper body is doing.
Certainly.
So we do perceive it, even though we don't see those hips.
Yep.
So Pam, I particularly loved when you were sewing, when he was telling you the story and you were kind of side-eyed looking at him. It gave me the image of women all the time. They're at their work and listening, but nobody pays attention to them because they're at the and it just was so powerful to me. She was like every woman there.
I agree.
There you go.
Oh.
Good observation.
Can I ask, Pam, are you standing when you tell, or are you sitting down?
I am standing right now. See,
Yeah.
I sometimes do sit, but I often choose to stand when I'm telling online.
Well, we kind of always thought that would work, because a lot of tellers are very mobile, some aren't.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're back a bit, and now it looks like I'm seeing you from the second row.
Okay.
When you're back.
Right.
But there's more of you.
Yeah.
Right. One can choose to go back. I mean, because when we're on a stage, we like to maybe move about, and we use, Cooper's talking about his hips, and we can use our legs and our feet and our toes, which isn't going to happen here. But I don't ever choose to go all the way back so you can see my whole body, although I've seen some people do that effectively. So we just are playing and learning.
My opinion generally, so I feel many people have been conditioned by film, and what Anne and Pam and I are all sitting in right now is called a close medium shot in film, which is effectively the sternum upwards, which is the shot that is generally used for most conversation in film.
Mm-hmm.
And it is what we as people generally focus on with someone maybe 3 or 4 feet away from us. Where if I back up a bunch into what's called a full medium shot, which is waist up, that is in film used as an establishing shot. It's how we might focus on one another if we're 15 feet away. And so film uses these shots to get people closer, but you rarely in film have a conversation in close medium shot or full medium shot, which is knee up. And so, I think, Tom, we could get really esoteric about this, but I have been leaning into what people are used to on film. And that my instinct is that when I'm looking at people from the waist up, I want to lean into the screen because I'm used to seeing people from the sternum up, because that's what I'm used to in the film shot.
Yeah.
So are you, Cooper, are you on a stool with wheels?
No, I am sitting on my floor on a meditation pillow.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe that was the way you could adjust and move if you needed to.
No, and so it actually makes scooting sort of awkward because it doesn't roll well.
Maybe some little wheels.
Yeah. The wheels on your meditation. Yeah.
Oh.
Thanks.
I love it. Like a kid on the floor. That's awesome. Sitting around the campfire. It's good.
I gotta take this dog out before he starts barking again.
Yeah. It's good to see you, Karen and Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
Y'all take care.
Going
Stay
to.
safe.
Bye.
See you next time.
Indeed.
Night.
Bye.
Oh, thank you all. That was wonderful. And we wanted to jump in here and say, particularly to Cooper, thank you. That was wonderful. And you did the best introduction to Zoom that I've ever seen anybody do. That was really appreciated. Thank you.
You're most welcome. I endeavor to do it because there's a lot of people that Zoom is something they use, but you don't know where the button is.
Right.
And so I realized halfway through that I had forgot the little chat thing too, because someone messaged me and said, I'm getting a pop-up. Make it stop. So I need to write that in. But you're most welcome. You're most
Yeah,
welcome.
and I do tech support all day, and I just wanted to say that was great.
Thank you so much. That means a lot.
And we loved all the stories. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, Liz. Bye, Will.
Thank you.
Oh.
I have a question. Cooper, you were hysterical. Thank you.
Right?
Oh my God.
Cooper was the funniest of the evening.
Oh, yeah.
He's oath forever now.
It just didn't stop.
This is my theme for the evening is devil abuse. That's what the theme is for the evening. It was almost pork products in hell, but we decided against the two butchers in hell, and instead we had the grave mound, so we went with devil abuse. Yes, it's
Funniest you've ever been.
I do funny stories sometimes.
Yeah, he sure does.
Do them very well.
Said they had a question.
When you will do them again.
Sorry, you had a question, Steph?
Yes, could I ask?
I missed who said it, but someone.
Oh, Mike, yes.
Oh, yes. I heard Pam said earlier about how she do live on Facebook. I was wondering if you will send us like your social media, and everyone else, if you have a social media, Cooper and Rachel, and yeah, I would love to follow you all.
Great. You should have gotten a email about 15 minutes ago, which includes a link to Pam's Facebook. Anne and I are Stories with Spirit on Facebook, and then when I send out the I can eventually talk. When I send out the recording, I will include Anne and I's social media handles on there as well.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I love the stories.
Thank you. And Steph has just posted Stories with Spirits Facebook there.
Yeah, I don't know where mine is.
Yeah, my Facebook Rachel Ann Harding page is occasionally posted on. So if you want to you can find me also at Ann Harding. It's a picture of me wistfully looking out a window. It's what you do when you're on a train. You can find me there too. But I'm also I'm occasionally active on Instagram too.
And my live storytelling and the recordings of them are always set to public. So it should be available always.
Do you have a day that you do those, Pam?
I do it every Friday at 11:05 a.m. Mountain Time.
11:05. That is very precise.
It's very precise.
Yeah, that's the way it is.
Oh. Anything else, or should we wrap up now? We've been here a little while.
Thank you. It was lovely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Looking forward to March already.
Thank you. Us too.
Yeah, we are so excited about that one.
I was having that problem last week where I was like, Cooper, you have to actually rehearse the stories for this month before you begin really working the stories for next month. I was like, no, but Rumpelstiltskin, I'm putting it together.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye. Stay warm.
Stay warm.
Bye. Yeah, I had that same thing, Cooper. I'm teaching 11 workshops this coming week. And so it was like, no, but I have to prepare snow women.
Wow. Where are you teaching? What are you?
At some schools.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, nice.
Yeah.
That's intense.
I was like, no, I want to do story work, not workshop.
Yup, it's different brains.
Yep.
Change
This is
gears.
great tonight. Thanks everybody for being here.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Oh. All right.
Fabulous to hear you all. Thank you.
It's good to
So
see you,
good to see
Danetta.
Danny.
I'm glad I got to be here.
Me too.
All right, friends, with that, I'm going to stop.